Say Antarctica, and the first image for many people is the penguin. It's an appealing image, dignified like dinner-suited head waiters, but often comic too. We easily think of them as the high society of the South Pole. Most of the appeal, though, lies in what we project of ourselves onto them. In reality, their society is very much their own. There are 17 species of penguin. Most live on sub-Antarctic islands. Only 2 live in Antarctica itself, the emperor and the smaller adelie. For the scientists, the viewing conditions in Antarctica are ideal. Lots of flightless birds in a small space, no trees to block the view, 24 hours of daylight. So it's easy to observe their behaviour. But it isn't always so easy to interpret it. Ewan Young is Professor of Zoology at Auckland University.
The real problem when looking at the behaviour is that we're interpreting what the bird's doing without being able to ask it questions, so that it always is going to be at third or second hand.
So even the experts can't avoid building in some preconceptions. What makes them experts, though, is that they do so in a systematic way. They make their observations within the framework of an overall theory. Each branch of science has its own overall or unifying theory. In geology, it's tectonic plates. In nuclear physics, Einstein's theory of relativity.
There you go.
The best unifying theory we have in biology is no doubt Darwinian selection. And the crucial part of that is the selection of the best adapted individuals at that time for that environment. And crucially then, the best thing is how does a male and female find each other, know they're good stock and going to breed successfully.
The breeding cycle then is vital in selecting whether a species is likely to survive. For the adelie, it starts in late October when the males come ashore after a winter feeding at sea. The territorial instinct in the adelie is very strong. They'll fight hard to keep the same nest site as last year or try for a better one. Not easy to do when there isn't much space, and even more difficult with new breeders trying to muscle in. With territorial claims settled, things quieten down and they start to build or repair the nest. Prime sites are the tops of ridges for good drainage later when it gets wet. Pebbles are the only available material, and they'll lift the eggs and chicks out of the water that will be trapped by the season's droppings. And they'll be needed to stop the eggs rolling about in the confusion to come. Some days later, the females come ashore. For the old hands, the task now is to re-establish last year's partnership. Barring accidents, the adelie pair bond lasts a lifetime, about 20 years.
middle of a great amorphous rookery, the two birds have to be able to find each other, they have to be able to recognise each other as parts of the same pair. So they go through very loud mutual displays of calling each other with their heads coming up together and rocking, or bowing in which the heads are coming down together. And that's certainly part, first, of recognition, and then pair bond reinforcing.
We know that displays are a crucial step in the selection process, but we don't really know how they work. In fact, we don't even know how the penguins tell the sexes apart.
Faced with a whole colony of Adelie penguins, we can't tell male from female, which means that we're having to watch them long enough to identify patterns associated with each sex. If you don't do that and want to get a straight, quick identification, you have to go around and check the females for tread marks on the back, the dirty marks of the feet where the male's been jumping on top of the female before copulation.
After the noise and kerfuffle of mating, the successful pairs lay their eggs, 2 of them, and incubation starts. The parents take turns sitting. The other, and all the unsuccessful birds, go back to sea to feed. The eggs hatch in December. Rearing the chicks brings about several changing patterns of behaviour within the colony. At first sight, some of these don't make a lot of sense.
The chicks have to be covered at first. They are too small to be left on their own. They'll be trampled around in the rookeries, which are great heaving masses of birds often, so that one parent has to stay with them the whole time, and he or she is feeding them regularly. Yeah, it's a surprising thing that at the time when the chicks and the breeding is really at a critical phase, that there's a great resurgence of birds back in onto the rookery. These are failed breeders, they lost their eggs earlier, and the young ones are coming in. And there's an awful lot of fighting at that time because there's territory reoccupation going on, and there's mate reoccupation, and you see the birds at their worst. And they will then fight willy-nilly right through the rookery.
In nature, we don't often see a species behaving in a way that seems to upset its own chances of breeding success. It's hard to explain, but we think that the unsuccessful breeders are staking claims for next season, both for a territory and for a mate.
That's the only reasonable explanation there is for it. But the balance between losing your eggs in one year because of all the fighting and gaining extra breeding in the next year, I don't think we've ever looked at that properly.
The Antarctic summer is short, so the chicks must grow fast. By the time they're 3 or 4 weeks old, they'll be getting up to 1/3 of their weight at one feed. The meals are huge, but infrequent. To keep up with the demand, both parents spend their full time feeding. They have to abandon the chicks, and the social pattern changes again.
Once the chicks are mobile and they begin moving around in the colonies themselves, then they certainly come together as little heaps and clots. In bad weather, harsh conditions, then the chicks, to keep warm, huddle together very tightly. In warm conditions, they simply lie around in the territory like heaps of down and fluff.
With the chicks often away from the home territory, meal times become movable feasts. Feeding chases are partly a recognition mechanism. But why is it so important to feed only your own family?
I think that's very clear, that you must look after your own genetically related offspring. The parents are desperately ensuring that their own genetic material, both as eggs and chicks, is being held by them and protected and nurtured by them. So that we see a lot of very fierce behaviour against young chicks which are loose in the colony, because they belong really to unsuccessful breeders. And the last thing that wants to happen is those chicks with their genetic strains to be perpetuated through the group.
The rearing phase lasts about 6 weeks. In about mid-February, instinct drives the young birds to face the sea for the first time. The breeding cycle is complete. For both parents and chicks, there have been many hazards to overcome. A snowfall at the wrong moment. And the aftermath is no less dangerous. For the parents, the need to enter and leave the water continually exposes them to the leopard seal. Although the seals feed mainly on krill, a few hang about off penguin colonies for the odd tasty snack. But for the chicks, the most obvious hazard is the skua. So far, we've looked at the Adelie in isolation. But to understand a species fully, we must see how it fits in with the others around it.
The simplest behaviour is obviously to look at a single species, but in the end that has to be dumped into a community of other species and into a whole environment. So that the beauty about the Antarctic, we've got a very close interaction between the Adelie penguin and the Antarctic skua. And that's a superb interaction because they are very common, both of them are very easily seen, so that you can look at different situations.
But when you're looking at interspecies behaviour, it's even easier to get things wrong.
Well, I think traditionally that the skuas were so obvious on the penguin rookeries, their behaviour seemed so bestial because they had so much trouble killing chicks and taking eggs, that without really doing any counting or looking at the food required, yes, everybody thought that skuas were entirely dependent on penguin rookeries for their food. But probably by far the greater proportion of them are feeding on their own at sea for most of the year. It doesn't take much observation really to see that they're not good at being predators. They can grab chicks all right and yank them out of a colony, but then they don't know what to do with it. The only way they seem to be able to kill them is to keep on banging the head down hard. And if the chick is flopping round, it's liable to run underneath them for shelter, and then the skuas get very embarrassed about it and run away. They can't kill the things they've got, and they have trouble getting into eggs. They eat very slowly and very badly. They're very messy. So they don't impress at all as being a predator. But having got the carcass and killed it, finally, then they have a lot of trouble getting in. The classic way for a predator to do it is simply put the foot against the carcass on the ground and yank with the beak, and they've got this great hook which they'll do that with. Skuas don't do that, so they have to use the weight. They just peck at it and peck at it. It's very slow. And once they get to the bigger pieces, like ripping the skeleton apart, then you need two of them. And they get a chunk each and they just yank it apart, pulling very hard against each other, in the absence of an effective way to do it on their own. We're really saying, how long has it been able to live in the Antarctic in this association or with penguins? We now think from the geologists and the glaciologists that Antarctica, the Ross Sea area, has been habitable by penguins and skuas for no less than 6,000 years. So that this behaviour isn't something which is aberrant because the birds have only just shifted there, but I think is inbuilt because of their sea feeding behaviour. That is, it's perfect for fish, which you just take and spin around in the beak and swallow head first.
The skua seems ill-adapted to Antarctica in another and perhaps even more crucial way.
The sympathy traditionally has been with the penguins, but when you look at the breeding success of the two birds, the skuas are much less successful. Part of that is because of the climate. The birds get hit with bad weather and the snowstorms, and then they can't feed at sea because the sea ice hasn't moved and the chicks starve. But mostly it's because very soon after the hatching, the older chick attacks the younger chick and chases it away. Now this is sibling aggression. It occurs in many predators, including the hawks and the eagles, but just seems very unrealistic in an Antarctic environment.
Just like the penguins fighting through their own rookeries, this skua behaviour would seem to reduce the chances of breeding success. Surely realistic behaviour would increase them. And it's not as though all skuas behave this way. The chicks of the Chatham Island skua live together very amicably right from hatching.
Okay, it's 29296. 29296. Right.
It's to the Chathams, 2,000 miles north of Antarctica, that Ewan Young has come to try and find some answers. The field work is similar, but the results quite different. A much higher proportion of Chatham Island pairs raise both chicks successfully to maturity.
Okay, I'll just check that. 29296.
But making a reliable comparison is not easy.
We expected going to the Chathams that we would be looking at much the same sort of bird. Stepping ashore, obviously, it was very different. The birds are standing up in long grass. It's an easier climate. The wind is still there, but it's warmer. The food supply is very different. They are not feeding at sea. They are feeding almost entirely on petrels. So those factors are very different. But I think the key to the difference is that the tolerance of the older chick is much greater in the Chatham's populations than it is in the Antarctic populations. That is, they don't respond so aggressively when they become hungry. We never expected in going to the Chathams we'd stumble across another whole problem and a very great difference. We found immediately that a good proportion of the birds on the Chathams are in trios, not in pairs. In the Antarctic, invariably there are pairs of birds raising chicks. And then we go to the Chathams, what do we find? 3 birds on a territory, all cooperating as a unit to raise the chicks. And that's very different.
And in wider terms, very interesting. For it means that a genetically unrelated bird is taking part, unselfishly, in the rearing process. Trios may turn out to be an evolutionary bridge between monogamous breeding, where only the parents are involved, like the penguins, and communal breeding, where the whole community cooperates to raise the young. But meanwhile, their discovery has done nothing to clarify the Antarctic comparison.
The Chatham's birds, and as far as I know, most of the sub-Antarctic birds raise both their chicks. So you would expect, in fact, in the more severe Antarctic climate, that the Antarctic bird would need to raise more chicks. So we simply find the behaviour in the Antarctic anomalous.
The more we find out about Antarctica, the more we realise we don't really know. 20 years ago, there were 1,500 breeding pairs of emperor penguins at this colony. 5 years ago, only a little over 100. We don't know whether the birds are moving elsewhere or just dying out. It's perhaps too simple to look on nature as static. Rather, we should see it as a continual process of change. But until we understand a lot more about what governs the process, particularly in Antarctica, we should treat it with a very special kind of respect.